Hi, it's Dr. Barik, and we're to our last week. So I tried to think about how to stack things so that we ended on a more positive note. So this week we're thinking about, okay, with everything we've learned about the inequality, about the disparate outcomes, what can we do with that information? I also wanted to go back and really go over intersectionality in a greater depth. So partly the purpose of this week is to really reflect and bring together everything we've learned in this course, noticing what's next. This is not, you're not done learning about differences, about the experiences of women, about how it affects our well-being, our psychology, our perception of the world, our mental health, our physical health. It's also to think about advocacy, what, why, and how. So what can we do? Why are we doing it? And how are we doing it? And then really just increasing that understanding of intersectionality. So I've got some more challenging readings for you this week, recognizing also how feminism and psychology have historically focused on the lived experiences of upper class white women, how that's really defined womanhood for us and why that's a problem. And then also thinking again, you're not done understanding the experiences of people who are different from you. And so thinking about how to keep developing greater intersectional awareness. So the first one, relational race privilege and white patriarchy. I originally wanted to do this the first week, but for one, that week just had a lot in it and I had to cut something. But also I thought that it was a little heavy for the first week. Parts of it are still really challenging for me. So if you struggled reading it, I would say don't give up. Some parts are easier than others. So if you couldn't get through it the whole way the first time, go back and try again. And also remember that anytime the first time you're encountering new ideas is always more difficult. So Hurtado really talks about how race, class, which is this education and income together, and gender are all intertwined. And so you can't really look at any one in isolation. You really have to look at the whole context. And she talked about how white women partner with and raise leaders in general, whereas women of color partner with and raise workers. And again, it's difficult because if you're a white woman in poverty, it's really hard to believe that you have this different experience. And again, we often equate white with upper class, but we also have to recognize that even within poverty, there are differences in mobility, in perception, in a lot of privilege for white versus black women or other women of color. And one thing that really stood out to me is the idea that women have earned enough equality to grow complacent. So it's gotten just good enough that we forget how much it sucks. We kind of don't, and we often don't notice because we take for granted the way things are. And I've talked about that a few times, how I've noticed that in my own life. Like when women's soccer was a big deal with the 2019 World Cup, the Women's World Cup, it really affected me, even though I'm not a particular follower of soccer or any sports, because I realized that how absent that was from my childhood, the representation of women's sports mattering, of women coaches. Sorry, that's the last video, finishing saving. And that I had and what really struck me wasn't that it was missing, but that I didn't notice it was missing. I didn't know to be upset about that. So this is another deep and difficult one, and the font here is really small. So this one, I would like your feedback on some of these, if it would be better to put some of these earlier next time. And it's tough to know what to put at the beginning and what to put at the end. This talks a lot about sort of being aware of the lived experience of other people. And the thought of women as mothers and what we worry about for our children really affected me. I thought about the fears I have for my child who is coming from me, a white mother, and my spouse, an Indian American man, and kind of how he's perceived by the world, how that's going to affect how people interpret. For example, he has some difficulty focusing on what the rest of the group is doing and on redirecting his energy. And I'm very aware that his not being white affects the way that people interpret that. even if the people are lovely, even if they don't want to be racist, it's going to affect the way people interpret him. Just like the fact that he's big for his age and he looks like he's 6 months to a year to 2 years older than what he is going to affect the way that people interpret his behavior. And I think those fears, if I had a transracial adoption, so if I had a darker skinned child, I would have a different set of fears for how he's going to be perceived. So for example, particularly in places like airports, people of South Asian descent are viewed as being potentially dangerous. And people who are viewed as Latino or Black are perceived as criminal and dangerous in other ways. And I also, we're in this space where he doesn't have he just turned 2. He's just becoming more verbal. He doesn't have a clear gender identity. He certainly doesn't have a sexual identity yet. But I'm very aware that, for me, I don't know what's going to unfold for him. And when I look at the world, he's still at this age where he could fit a lot of those identities. So I think for me, reading about, again, I'm in this space as a new mother, as a mother of, for me, it's a son. And I'm very tuned into how parenting and perceptions of our children affects the experience of women. And again, I want to be very clear. I don't want to send a message that all women are mothers or all women should be mothers, or that if you're not a mother, there's something less womanly about you, but it is a common experience of women. I also really liked the way that this chapter kind of explained intersectionality. They described how the white women advocated for women. And so there's this, when we think of women's issues, we think of white women. When we think of Black issues, we think of Black men. And those were the groups that were really advocating for rights. And so there was no larger group to be with power of any sort to be advocating for Black women. Kind of everybody says, well, but you're really the other piece. There's also this sense, anytime we see a difference in outcomes, we have to assume that there is a difference in power. So we have to see the structure rather than having beliefs that we get what we deserve, that hard work really pays off, and people who are sick have probably done something to earn that sickness. People are paid what they're worth to the company, and if you created more value, you would be paid more. So being willing to see the structure and see the barriers over cherishing our beliefs that the world is fair, really. She also talks about singular consciousness, so thinking about one thing at a time, intersectional consciousness, which is kind of for people who are marginalized and who have these multiple identities. And then I like this term intersectional awareness to describe allies, because it's important as allies, and we're all allies for someone. There's always a group of some sort that we don't fit with. And it's important to remember we don't have to pretend to be or fully understand a group to be an advocate with them. It's also important to understand how the role of ally is different from the role as sort of an activist within that group. So having openness to experience, to encounters, that could be consuming media outside of your immediate group. It could be going to cultural events, being intentional about trying to have friends from a variety of worldviews. That can be difficult. It can feel like, well, but if I just happen to hang out with a lot of people, with similar backgrounds to me, how does that make me a bad person? And it certainly doesn't. But it's important to think about where you're finding your friends, where who you're spending time with, and trying to create environments where you can form friendships with other people from different places. Perspective taking is a part of empathy. It's part of my dissertation. So it's one of these little snippets of the psych world that I'm very familiar with. And in order to do perspective taking, you need cognitive skills. So you need to be able, you need the capacity to imagine someone else's experience. You need emotional skills to be able to kind of think about the emotions that would come out of different pieces. And then you have to actually care about what you're imagining. You have to care enough to try to imagine it, and then you have to actually be moved by what you're imagining in order to make changes. And there's also, so you have to be able to see the other person's perspective, and then that personal political salience. Does it matter enough to me? Am I moved to action? And that's a different type of empathy. So the most common empathy scale has a few different pieces, and this one I kind of think of, they call it fantasy, which is really sort of spontaneously imagining the experiences of other people and responding. So not just I can imagine your experience, but then I imagine it. It's like it happened to me. My favorite example for this, I remember one time I was in middle school and I was home. I was a latchkey kid and I was home reading. I think I was in eighth or ninth grade, so maybe not quite middle school. But I was reading and I heard my mom coming in the door, and I just had this sense of absolute relief, oh, thank goodness she's home. I have had the worst day and I need her. And all of a sudden I realized my day was fine. I'm reading a book about someone who just had the worst day. So it's that, how much do you take on? So if you ever hear me talk about why I don't watch horror movies, or I just can't watch a lot of things, it's because I take it on very personally. And so I have to protect myself. It's tough, though, because it's easy to want to create a little shell and not hear about anything terrible that exists in the world. It's also probably why you hear me talk a lot about how heavy this class is for me. It is very heavy for me. It weighs heavily on me, and a lot of it doesn't affect me directly. I have a job I like. I have a lot of stability. I have pretty good access to healthcare, and yet I still very much feel for the people who don't. She gives examples of some movements. She talks a little bit about Black Lives Matter and how that works on creating this intersectional awareness, and also model minority mutiny, so people who are pushing back against sort of dividing minorities into good and bad sections. And then I really love the way she talks about intersectional awareness as an ongoing practice, almost like recognizing that it is not a thing you achieve and then just have forever. It's more like daily personal hygiene. You just have to constantly keep it up. So embracing the uncomfortable, personal stories, museums of difficult events, getting feedback from other people, and really listen when people talk, hear the stories that they're sharing. My best advice is always to hang out with people who are smarter than you. And in this case, it's hanging out with people with greater intersectional awareness than you, and also hanging out with people who represent different groups than you do. You may not be able to magically find a delightfully eclectic group of besties to go brunch with, but you can go onto Twitter or other social media and follow outspoken people from different groups, and really hear their perspectives and really listen. Read the articles they share, think about it, and constantly try to grow. And then also thank them for their labor. Thank them for sharing things, for advocating, for helping you understand their experience, because it takes a lot of work and it does drag on people to do that. The next chapter, this class is an action. So thinking about the activist portion of psychology of women. And it's interesting to think, can we even have a psychology of women outside of a feminist perspective? Bell Hooks has defined has described society as being defined by white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. And it's that description of how each piece of that contributes to the way we experience U.S. society, again, very rooted within a particular society here. And really focuses on the hierarchical systems of power that benefit from having some groups with power and some groups without power. There's also the idea that the outside gets in, that it's impossible to keep yourself completely free of biased beliefs. So dominant discourse is androcentrism, so being focused on male as norm. gender polarization, so thinking that men and women are extremely different and that those differences are biologically essential. So biological essentialism, that these differences have to be the way they are. Instead, recognizing that there are socially constructive narratives that can be effectively challenged with scientific data. So, for example, we know that we can manipulate studies to make gender differences get bigger or smaller. And so that really has to make us question how real these effects are, or whether these effects mean what we think they mean. And also think about self-fulfilling prophecies. PMS is an example of that, where if I expect to feel a certain way, I'm going to either feel the way I expect to, or I'm going to look back and retroactively assign meaning based on what I expect to happen. And recognizing that we're enacting social scripts that uphold this cultural way of being, particularly a patriarchy where certain people hold power and other people do not. So the idea that the personal is political, that things that are often labeled as private or intimate actually have great power, or actually are related to who has power and privilege. And I've mentioned this before, the issue is if women's issues are always private, because that's our sphere, and the private should not be brought into political discourse, then that effectively leaves women out of politics and out of power. And so that is how I see rejecting the claim that private matters should be handled in the home. Because, again, it's essentially saying women should never have power. If you're saying women handle private matters stay in the home. I also thought it was interesting, there was a critique of that talk from the first week about everyone should be a feminist, and this author really critiques how popularizing feminism can disconnect it from the more, making feminism for everyone may take out the political power, because we kind of water down what it means to be feminist, and I hear this sense of complacency that then our goals get smaller. And then there's kind of this, okay, so what do we do? Part of it is education, challenging, donating to causes, thinking about the way we're socializing people, and also taking back control and decision-making over our own bodies. And she talks about collective action and vigilance. So a lot of these readings from this week do think about both intersectionality and how do you advocate, how do you move forward. The next one, there's too many chapters for me to assign, and also assign all the other stuff I want to assign, but they're really, really good. And so for this week, there's one chapter where you choose whatever you want. I highly encourage you to use this as one of your sources in your discussion post, if only because your peers may not have read it. And so it's great if you can focus on a couple main ideas from this chapter, so that if everyone shares one or two main ideas, then all the students get access to a little bit about a lot of chapters. And also think about if there's something that fits for your advocacy interests, fits with your other interests, or if you want to do start of that exposing yourself to other lived experiences. It could be great to choose something that's completely outside your experience. The last couple, this is a little bit selfish of me, but also for me, this was a really powerful experience last winter. A good friend of mine who's a breast surgeon had suggested had kind of just informed a legislator, hey, here's this issue where insurance doesn't cover treatments for fertility for people undergoing chemo, and that there are people who don't want to undergo chemo because they do not want to lose the option for biological children. And it's creating a lot of stress and a lot of difficulty for people who are already very vulnerable because they're, facing cancer. And what I like about this is the idea that advocacy can be big or small. So this person just kind of had a fortuitous run-in with a legislator and brought up an issue that was relevant to the people she served. The legislator, she was to some extent surprised that the legislator did follow up with it, but very, very pleasantly surprised, and then worked to give the legislator as much information and support as she could. And then she and one of her patients got to be there when the vote went through. So I looked. You don't see me in the video, but I'm in the background recording it for them. they were really, really excited, and it was really cool to get to be there and share in the day. So it's a few pieces. Part of it for Dr. Jadeja is she was listening and caring. So she actually listened to what her patients were telling her. I use patients because she's a physician, and that's the more appropriate term there. If you're in counseling or a psychologist, it would be a client. But she listened to her patients, and she spoke up. You know, just anytime you have someone's ear, just talking about the needs of the populations you work with, and then following through. So if there's a response, really jumping on that, maybe following up several times, and just continuing to advocate. When I was originally prepping this course, we were still sort of seeing what would happen. This video is when I believe the bill was on the governor's desk. Yeah, I think that's the title. That wasn't just me being clever. So focusing on the idea of personal choice and fertility, and again, underrepresented groups. Often when we think of cancer, we think of sort of old people, but in particular, if it happens to young adults, people who haven't started families or were just about to start families or really feel like their family isn't done yet, it can be very difficult. And it got signed. Governor Murphy signed it, and it's a law now that insurance companies have to cover this. And it's, again, this wasn't a huge advocacy campaign. This was just talking when you have someone's ear. And I think a lot of things happen when you do this kind of slow, consistent, persistent, trying to let people know about inequalities. So what did I leave out? Overall, in this course, we didn't talk much about career development. We did a little bit, and I realized even when I talked about friendships, we didn't talk about the importance of work friendships and work relationships. Lifespan development, especially older age, retirement, empty nesting. One of the chapters did mention it, but I really would have loved to have more focus on sort of just thinking about the lifespan, cradle to grave, and thinking about how women are affected at every stage. We also didn't talk a lot about marriage and relationship satisfaction. We didn't talk about siblings, friends. We didn't talk much about becoming a mother-in-law or becoming a grandparent. And these are all big steps, big experiences that a lot of women have. We also didn't talk hardly at all about divorce, separation, dating, and most of our discussions focused on heterosexual monogamous relationships, which doesn't, with high levels of commitment, which doesn't describe everyone. We touched on poverty a lot, but we really didn't jump in with both feet at any point. We also talked very little about single parenting or co-parenting with a former partner. And I make a distinction because I really do think that as difficult as it is to be separated from a partner and each parent, I think it's much more difficult to be the only parent available. And that I don't know that we really addressed at all. LGBTQIA issues, it's something that I try to keep at least at a minimum bringing up the absence of, but it really is something that is important to recognize. There's a lot of women who fall on these marginalized groups and just more generally underrepresented groups. We could have a whole course on the experiences of lots of groups. I also don't have mentioned on here, but worldwide experiences, so the experiences of women in other places, both better and worse than the U.S. as far as women's experiences go. We didn't really talk about. And we have a more limited historical perspective. And as I said, I think history really, history helps me avoid hubris. It helps me recognize places where people have been horribly wrong in the past. And it also helps me recognize that culture is not static, that American culture is not forever the way it is right now. And that helps me be less judgmental of cultures that I see as being behind the U.S. on issues like equality and women's rights. Let me know. I really am interested to know what else is missing from this course, what voices I've missed. I've tried to be as broad as I can without having a comprehensive textbook because that brings its own issues of cost and accessibility and just being really long. But I am also aware that most of my speakers are very well-educated white women that I've pulled from, and that affects a lot. Online courses are tough to revise, but I do want to revise slowly over time. And so it's great to know what to focus on when I do a revision, or thinking about what else I could add in, if there are assignments that I could change to pull in other perspectives more clearly. Thank you for going on this journey with me. I hope that you do feel like we ended on a note that was more growth focused, more positive, more movement oriented, because there's a lot of topics that are really difficult in this class. Thanks for coming along with me, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your semester.